The year was 2387, and the stars held more friends than enemies for humanity. Reuben Clark stood at the viewing window of Harmony Point Station and watched the ships arrive from across the galaxy. Each vessel carried representatives from the 12 species that made up the Galactic Council. Today would mark the first cultural exchange summit in galactic history. Reuben adjusted his formal diplomatic jacket and checked his watch. In 3 hours, he would represent all of humanity before beings who could travel between stars and manipulate matter with their thoughts. The responsibility felt heavy on his shoulders, but he had prepared for this moment his entire career. The newest members of the Galactic Council were arriving now. Their ship looked like a massive geometric crystal that reflected no light. These were the MIKA collective, and they had joined the Council only 6 months ago. Unlike the other species who had welcomed humanity with curiosity and warmth, the MIKA had shown nothing but cold calculation. Captain Lisa Rodriguez walked up beside him. She commanded the Earth Diplomatic Corps and had handpicked Reuben for this mission. Her expression was serious as she watched the MIKA ship dock with perfect mechanical precision. "They still refuse to acknowledge our cultural contributions," Lisa said. "Every proposal we make gets dismissed as primitive or inefficient." Reuben nodded. He had read all the reports. The MIKA were once biological beings like humans, but had replaced most of their bodies with cybernetic parts over thousands of years. They prized logic above all else and considered emotions to be evolutionary mistakes that should be corrected. They believe art and music are wastes of neural capacity. Reuben replied, "They cannot understand why we spend time and resources on things that do not directly improve survival or efficiency." Lisa sighed. "The other council members are starting to question our membership. If we cannot prove our value beyond military strength and basic technology, the MIKA influence might convince them we do not belong here." The docking bay doors opened, and the MIKA delegation entered the station. They moved with identical synchronized steps. Their cybernetic bodies were sleek and silver with glowing blue circuits visible beneath translucent skin panels. At their head walked Prime Logic Unit MIKA 7739. MIKA 7739 stood 7 feet tall with 4 arms and optical sensors instead of eyes. When they spoke, their voice came from speakers built into their throat rather than vocal cords. Everything about them suggested perfect efficiency and the elimination of anything unnecessary. "Greetings, human delegates," MIKA 7739 said as they approached. Their tone held no warmth or hostility, just neutral acknowledgement. "We proceed to assigned quarters for optimal rest cycle before formal discussions begin." "Welcome to Harmony Point," Reuben said with a smile. "We hope you find the accommodation suitable. The station has facilities for many different biological and technological needs." MIKA 7739 tilted their head exactly 15 degrees. "Accommodation requirements are already calculated and transmitted to station systems. Human emotional displays such as smiling serve no logical function in diplomatic protocol." Jake Morrison, the deputy ambassador, stepped forward. He was younger than Reuben and believed in direct confrontation over subtle diplomacy. "Perhaps you might find our perspectives valuable if you gave them a chance instead of dismissing everything human as primitive." "Evaluation is continuous," MIKA 7739 replied. "Current data suggests human contributions to galactic civilization remain limited to basic military tactics and elementary technological applications. Cultural expressions appear to be evolutionary remnants with no practical application." Karen Wells, the cultural attaché, cleared her throat. She specialized in interspecies communication and had studied every known alien culture. "Many species find great value in human arts. The Zelani have requested human musicians for their healing ceremonies. The Throck trade rare minerals for human literature." MIKA 7739 processed this information for exactly 2.3 seconds. These species demonstrate similar evolutionary inefficiencies. The fact that multiple primitive cultures share the same weaknesses does not validate the weaknesses themselves. Reuben felt his diplomatic training take over. Getting angry would prove nothing and might damage relations permanently. "Perhaps we might discuss this during the formal sessions. I am sure we can find common ground." "Common ground requires shared logical frameworks," MIKA 7739 said. "Human artistic pursuits exist outside logical frameworks. They serve no survival function, provide no efficiency improvements, and consume resources that could be allocated to productive activities." The MIKA delegation moved past them toward their quarters. Their footsteps made identical metallic sounds against the station floor. Reuben watched them go and felt a familiar ache in his fingers. Before becoming a diplomat, he had been a concert pianist. His hands remembered the feeling of keys beneath his fingertips and the way music could transform a room full of strangers into a unified audience. "They are impossible," Jake muttered. "How do you reason with beings who have eliminated their capacity for reason beyond pure calculation?" Karen shook her head. "They still have biological brains underneath all that technology. The cybernetics enhance and direct their thoughts, but the core consciousness remains organic. There must be something left of what they were before." Lisa looked at Reuben. "You have been quiet." "What are you thinking?" Reuben continued staring down the corridor where the MIKA had disappeared. "I am thinking about music. About how mathematics and emotion can exist in the same space without contradicting each other. Chopin understood this. Bach understood this. Every composer who ever lived found ways to make numbers sing." "The MIKA do not sing," Jake said. "They calculate and optimize and analyze, but they do not create anything beautiful." "Maybe they have forgotten how," Reuben replied. "Maybe they need to be reminded." The first formal session would begin in 2 hours. Representatives from all 12 species would gather in the main assembly hall to discuss trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense treaties. The humans would present their proposals, and the MIKA would likely dismiss them as they had dismissed everything else. But Reuben was already thinking beyond the formal sessions. Somewhere on this station there might be a piano. Most Earth diplomatic facilities included musical instruments for stress relief and cultural demonstrations. If he could find one, if he could prepare the right piece, if he could create the right moment, perhaps, the MIKA might discover that logic and beauty were not enemies after all. The stars outside the window seemed brighter now. In a few hours, the future of human membership in the Galactic Council might depend, not on treaties or technology, but on 37 minutes of 19th century Polish music and whether mathematics could still remember how to dance. Reuben spent the night staring at the ceiling of his quarters. Sleep would not come despite his exhaustion. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw MIKA 7739's optical sensors analyzing him with cold precision. The weight of what he had committed to press down on him like the gravity of a massive planet. At dawn, he walked through the empty corridors of Harmony Point, searching for what he hoped existed somewhere on the station. Past the diplomatic offices and meeting rooms, past the sleeping quarters and dining facilities, he found what he was looking for in the abandoned recreation center. The room had been designed for human cultural activities during previous diplomatic missions. Dust covers protected various instruments and equipment that had not been used in months. In the center of the space sat a Steinway concert grand piano covered by a heavy cloth. Reuben pulled away the covering and lifted the keyboard lid. The keys were real ivory and ebony from Earth, crafted by master builders who understood that some things could not be improved by technology. He pressed middle C and listened to the note ring through the empty room. The piano was slightly out of tune, but still magnificent. "I wondered when you would find this place." Reuben turned to see Karen Wells standing in the doorway. She carried 2 cups of coffee and looked like she had not slept either. "I remembered reading about musical instruments in the station manifest," she said, walking over to hand him a cup. "This piano was installed 3 years ago for a cultural exchange with the Melodian Confederation. It has been waiting here ever since." "Waiting for what?" Reuben asked, sitting down on the bench and running his fingers across the keys without pressing them. "Waiting for someone who understands that diplomacy is not always about words and treaties and logical arguments. Sometimes it is about reaching deeper than language can go." Reuben played a few scales to test the piano's responsiveness. The action was smooth and the tone was rich despite the tuning issues. "Jake thinks I have lost my mind. He believes I am risking everything for a gesture that cannot possibly work." Karen sat down beside him on the bench. "Jake is a good diplomat, but he thinks like a human. He cannot imagine consciousness that works differently from ours. The MIKA are not human minds with cybernetic enhancements. They are something new, something that might respond to approaches we have never tried, or something that has moved so far beyond what they once were that nothing can reach them anymore." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Reuben let his fingers find the opening of Chopin's Ballade No. 1. The melody emerged slowly, as if the piano was remembering how to sing. The music filled the empty room and seemed to push back the shadows in the corners. "Why this piece?" Karen asked. "Because it is mathematics and emotion in perfect balance," Reuben replied without stopping. Chopin understood that technical precision and emotional truth were not opposites but partners. Every note serves both the logical structure and the emotional journey. The MIKA respect mathematics. Perhaps they can find their way to beauty through numbers. Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway looking agitated. "The entire diplomatic corps is talking about what happened at dinner. Half the delegates think you are brilliant and half think you are insane. Captain Rodriguez wants to see you immediately." Reuben finished the phrase he was playing before responding. "Tell her I will be there in 1 hour. I need to practice." "Practice," Jake said incredulously. "You are risking the future of human membership in the Galactic Council on a piano recital, and you need to practice. Music is not like diplomacy," Reuben said, turning to face him. "You cannot fake your way through it with clever words and careful negotiations. Every note either serves the whole or destroys it. There is no middle ground." Jake left, shaking his head. Karen remained on the bench listening as Reuben worked through difficult passages and technical challenges. The piano gradually came into better tune as the strings warmed and settled. "The MIKA have been monitoring human musical patterns since they arrived," Karen said. "Their processors are analyzing harmonic structures and mathematical relationships in our compositions. They are preparing to demonstrate their immunity to what they call emotional manipulation." "Good," Reuben replied. "Let them analyze. Mathematics cannot be hidden or disguised. It is what it is. If they study Chopin closely enough, they might discover something their calculations did not predict." Captain Rodriguez found them 2 hours later. She entered the recreation center with the purposeful stride of someone who commanded starships and managed interstellar crises. Her expression was serious but not angry. "The council has agreed to your demonstration," she said without preamble. "Tomorrow evening in the main assembly hall. All 12 species will attend, including the complete MIKA delegation. No pressure." Reuben smiled despite his nervousness. "No pressure at all. I have to ask if you are certain about this. We have other options. We can withdraw the cultural proposals and focus on areas where the MIKA acknowledge our competence. Military tactics, basic engineering, resource management, and become junior members of a council that sees us as useful but not valuable," Reuben replied. Captain Humanity did not reach the stars by accepting limitations. We reached them by insisting that impossible. Things were simply things that had not been accomplished yet. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I chose you for this mission because you understand that diplomacy requires risks, but this feels like more than a risk. This feels like everything." "Maybe it is everything," Reuben said. "Maybe the question is not whether humanity belongs in the Galactic Council, but whether the Galactic Council is ready for what humanity represents. Art and science working together, logic and emotion strengthening each other instead of fighting. And if the MIKA are not ready, then we learn something important about the universe we live in." Rodriguez left them alone again. The afternoon passed quickly as Reuben worked through the complete ballade multiple times. His fingers remembered the patterns, but his mind focused on the meaning behind each phrase. This was not just a performance but a conversation, a dialogue between mathematical precision and emotional truth. As evening approached, Karen helped him prepare the assembly hall. They moved the piano to the center of the space where every seat would have a clear view. The acoustics were excellent, designed for multilingual communication and sensitive to subtle variations in tone and pitch. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you should know that this was the right choice," Karen said as they tested the piano one final time. "The MIKA need to be challenged. They need to discover that efficiency without beauty is not advancement but retreat." Reuben played the final chord of the ballade and listened to it fade into silence. Tomorrow he would discover whether 37 minutes of music could bridge the gap between pure logic and the mysterious something more that made consciousness worth having. The stars outside the assembly hall windows seemed to be waiting for an answer. The formal dinner brought all 12 species together in the station's grand dining hall. Long tables accommodated different body types and dietary requirements, while translation devices hummed quietly in the background. Reuben sat between a crystalline Vorthon delegate and a tentacled Aquari ambassador. The conversation flowed in multiple languages, creating a symphony of diplomatic politeness. MIKA 7739 sat at the head table with the other senior delegates. They did not eat food, but instead plugged a small cable into a port behind their left ear to receive nutritional supplements directly. Their optical sensors swept the room in regular patterns, analyzing everything and everyone. The Zelani ambassador was describing their recent cultural festival when MIKA 7739 interrupted. These celebrations serve no productive function. Resources allocated to decorative displays and musical performances could be redirected to infrastructure development or technological advancement. A uncomfortable silence fell over the nearby tables. The Zelani were known for their gentle nature and artistic sensibilities. Their ambassador's skin changed from pale blue to darker purple, indicating distress. Captain Rodriguez set down her fork carefully. Cultural celebrations strengthen social bonds and improve community cooperation. These benefits translate directly to increased productivity and social stability. MIKA 7739 turned their attention to her. Correlation does not equal causation. Social stability can be achieved through logical organization and efficient resource distribution. Emotional manipulation through artistic displays represents primitive control mechanisms. Reuben felt the tension building around the table. Other species delegates were exchanging glances and whispering among themselves. The MIKA had been making similar comments throughout their 6 months in the council, but never so publicly or dismissively. Ambassador Chen of the Throck Federation leaned forward. His species valued honor and respected strength in all its forms. Human art has brought joy to our people. Their stories teach lessons about courage and sacrifice. These are not primitive concepts, but advanced understanding of what makes civilization worthwhile. Joy is a chemical reaction, MIKA 7739 replied without emotion. Chemical reactions can be induced more efficiently through direct neural stimulation. Stories that teach lessons demonstrate inefficient information transfer. Direct data upload provides the same knowledge without unnecessary narrative structures. Jake Morrison stood up abruptly. His face was red and his hands were clenched into fists. You talk about efficiency, but what is the point of existing if existence has no beauty or meaning or purpose beyond mere survival? MIKA 7739 regarded him with the same expression they used for everything else. Survival and expansion represent the primary objectives of any successful species. Beauty and meaning are subjective experiences that cannot be quantified or optimized. Purpose beyond continuation serves no logical function. The Aquari ambassador spoke in a voice like flowing water. Without art, we would have no way to share our deepest experiences across species barriers. Human music helps us understand emotions we do not naturally possess. This understanding improves cooperation and prevents conflicts. Emotional understanding can be achieved through direct neural mapping and data analysis, MIKA 7739 said. Artistic interpretation introduces errors and misunderstandings. Precise communication eliminates the need for metaphorical or symbolic representations. Karen Wells had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. Art is not just communication. It is exploration. It is the search for truths that cannot be calculated or measured. It is how we discover new ways of thinking and being. MIKA 7739 processed her words for several seconds. Truth is objective and measurable. Subjective experiences do not constitute truth. New ways of thinking are only valuable if they increase efficiency or survival probability. Art produces neither result. The dining hall had grown very quiet. Representatives from species across the galaxy were watching this exchange with growing concern. Reuben realized that this moment might determine not just human membership in the council, but the future relationship between logical and creative civilizations. He stood slowly and looked directly at MIKA 7739. Speak of efficiency and survival. But what about growth? What about becoming more than what you were? What about reaching beyond the limits of pure calculation to touch something greater? Growth is measured in technological advancement and resource acquisition, MIKA 7739 replied. Becoming more requires quantifiable improvement in capability or capacity. Calculation represents the highest form of consciousness. There is nothing greater. Captain Rodriguez also stood. then you will never understand what makes humanity valuable to this council. Our art, our music, our stories, these are not weaknesses or inefficiencies. They are our greatest strengths. They are how we transform the universe from a collection of facts into a home. MIKA 7739 stood as well. Their 7-foot frame towered over the human delegates. Your statement demonstrates the logical fallacy at the core of human thinking. The universe is a collection of facts. Transforming perception of facts does not change the facts themselves. Homes are shelter structures. Emotional attachment to locations serves no survival function. The challenge hung in the air like electricity before a storm. Other delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked sympathetic to the human position while others seemed uncertain. The MIKA influence was clearly growing within the council. Reuben felt his diplomatic training warring with his artistic soul. Every instinct told him to respond with logic and careful arguments. But logic had not worked with the MIKA. Perhaps it was time to try a different approach. You believe human artistic expressions are meaningless, he said quietly. You believe they serve no function and provide no value to advanced civilizations. Correct. MIKA 7739 replied immediately. Then you would not object to a demonstration. MIKA 7739 tilted their head. Clarification required. Reuben felt his heart beating faster. A cultural demonstration. One human artistic performance. If it fails to affect you or provide any meaningful value, then humanity will withdraw our cultural proposals and focus solely on technological and military contributions to the council. The dining hall fell completely silent. Every being present understood the stakes of such a challenge. Jake looked alarmed while Karen appeared intrigued. Captain Rodriguez watched Reuben with calculating eyes. MIKA 7739 stood motionless for 30 seconds. Their internal processors were clearly analyzing every aspect of the proposal. Finally they spoke, challenge accepted. One human artistic performance will be evaluated according to logical standards. When it fails to produce measurable effects or meaningful value, the discussion will be concluded permanently. Reuben nodded. Tomorrow evening in the main assembly hall, I will perform alone with no technological assistance or special effects. Just one human and one piece of music. MIKA 7739's optical sensors focused on him intently. Acceptable parameters. Failure is mathematically certain. As the dinner concluded and delegates began returning to their quarters, Reuben remained in his seat. He had just committed himself, and possibly all of humanity, to a test that seemed impossible to pass. How do you move beings who have eliminated their capacity to be moved? How do you touch hearts that have been replaced with circuits? But somewhere in the back of his mind he could hear the opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. Mathematics and emotion dancing together in perfect harmony. Tomorrow he would discover if beauty could still speak to logic, or if the universe truly was nothing more than a collection of cold facts. The main assembly hall filled slowly as representatives from across the galaxy took their seats. Reuben watched from behind the stage curtain as beings of every imaginable form found places in the carefully arranged seating. The Zelani delegates glowed softly blue in the dimmed lighting, while the Throck representatives tested the strength of their reinforced chairs. Aquari ambassadors had special tanks that allowed them to remain submerged while still participating in the proceedings. Captain Rodriguez checked her watch and nodded to the technical staff. All delegations are present. Begin when ready. Reuben felt his hands trembling slightly as he walked to the piano. The instrument sat alone in a pool of warm light at the center of the hall. Every optical sensor, crystalline eye, and organic pupil in the room focused on him as he sat down and adjusted the bench height. The MIKA delegation occupied the front row in perfect symmetrical formation. MIKA 7739 sat directly in the center with identical units arranged on either side. Their optical sensors tracked Reuben's movements with mechanical precision, while their internal processors continued analyzing musical patterns and harmonic relationships. Before I begin, Reuben said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic system, I want to explain why I chose this particular piece. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor was composed in 1831 by a young man far from home during a time of great political upheaval. He took mathematical structures that had existed for centuries and filled them with emotions that were entirely his own. He paused and looked directly at MIKA 739. This piece proves that logic and feeling are not enemies but partners in the search for truth. Every note serves both the mathematical structure and the emotional journey. There is nothing random or inefficient about beauty when it emerges from perfect understanding. MIKA 7739's optical sensors focused on him with increased intensity. Mathematical structures can be analyzed without subjective interpretation. Emotional content does not alter mathematical relationships. Begin demonstration. Reuben placed his hands over the keys and took a deep breath. The hall fell completely silent except for the soft humming of life support systems and translation devices. Then his right hand found the opening melody, and the first notes of the ballade filled the space between worlds. The opening was deceptively simple, a single melodic line that seemed to question itself with each phrase. But underneath the simplicity lay complex harmonic relationships that would develop and transform throughout the piece. Reuben played with the careful precision of a mathematician and the emotional understanding of a poet. The MIKA units in the front row continued their synchronized monitoring, but something subtle began to change. Their optical sensors, which normally swept the room in regular patterns, started focusing more intently on the piano. MIKA 7739's head tilted slightly as if processing unexpected data. As the music developed into the first major section, Reuben felt the familiar magic of live performance. The piano responded to his touch like a living thing, while the acoustics of the hall shaped each note into perfect clarity. He was no longer thinking about diplomacy or alien psychology, but simply about serving the music and letting it speak for itself. The Ceylani delegates began to glow more brightly, their skin shifting through subtle color changes that matched the harmonic progressions. The Aquari created gentle ripples in their tanks that pulsed in rhythm with the musical phrases. Even the usually stoic Throck representatives leaned forward in their seats, showing unusual interest in the proceedings. But Reuben's attention remained focused on the MIKA. Their normal synchronized movements had become slightly irregular. MIKA 7739's secondary processors were clearly working harder than usual, indicated by increased activity in their visible circuit patterns. For beings who prided themselves on predictable efficiency, they were showing signs of something unexpected. The music reached the lyrical second theme, where Chopin's genius truly emerged. Mathematical precision and emotional depth became inseparable as the melody soared over complex harmonic foundations. Each phrase built on the previous one, creating architectural structures that were both logically sound and emotionally overwhelming. MIKA 7739's optical sensors began to flicker in, patterns that seemed to mirror the musical phrasing. Other MIKA units started exhibiting similar behavior, their normally steady lights pulsing in sync with rhythmic elements they had never encountered before. The cybernetic beings who claimed emotions were evolutionary. Mistakes were responding to music in ways their own programming could not explain. Reuben pressed forward into the development section where all the musical themes collided and transformed. This was the mathematical heart of the piece, where Chopin demonstrated that emotion could be subjected to logical manipulation without losing its essential truth. Themes appeared in different keys at different speeds, combined with new material and broken apart before being rebuilt in unexpected ways. The effect on the MIKA delegation was becoming impossible to ignore. Their synchronized movements had given way to individual responses as each unit processed the musical information differently. MIKA 7739 stood perfectly still, but their internal systems were clearly working at maximum capacity, indicated by rapid flickering of their circuit displays. Other delegates in the hall began noticing the unusual MIKA behavior. Whispered conversations started in several languages as representatives pointed toward the front row. The beings who had dismissed human art as primitive inefficiency were demonstrating that something in this music reached beyond their logical defenses. As Reuben approached the climactic recapitulation section, he could feel the tension building throughout the hall. This was the moment where all the mathematical development would culminate in pure emotional release, where Chopin's architectural precision would serve his deepest artistic vision. The music crashed through the hall like a wave breaking against a cliff. Mathematical certainty and emotional truth merged into something that transcended both. Every note was precisely calculated yet spontaneously felt. Every phrase served the logical structure while expressing ineffable human experience. MIKA 7739's optical sensors had stopped their regular monitoring patterns entirely. They stared directly at the piano with an intensity that suggested processing overload. Other MIKA units began exhibiting behavior that could only be described as agitation. Their usually perfect formation started to break apart as Individual units responded differently to musical stimuli. The other species delegates watched in amazement as the cybernetic beings who claimed to have eliminated subjective experience struggled to process their first encounter with true aesthetic beauty. Mathematical patterns they understood, but mathematical patterns that served emotional truth created new categories of experience their systems were not designed to handle. Reuben felt sweat on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the hall. His fingers found every note with precise timing, while his mind remained focused on the musical architecture unfolding around him. This was more than performance now. This was communication between fundamentally different forms of consciousness. The final section approached like an inevitable mathematical conclusion. All the themes would return transformed by their journey through development. All the emotional content would be resolved through logical progression. Mathematics and music would prove once again that they had never been separate things but different names for the same search for perfect order underlying apparent chaos. As the last phrases began, MIKA 7739 took a single step forward, breaking their perfect formation for the first time since arriving at the station. Their optical sensors focused entirely on Reuben's hands as they moved across, the keys creating patterns of sound that their processors could analyze, but could not fully comprehend. The final chord approached, carrying with it the answer to questions that had not been asked when the evening began. The final section of the ballade unfolded like a mathematical proof written in pure emotion. Reuben's fingers moved across the keys with absolute precision, while his mind surrendered completely to the music's internal logic. Every phrase built upon the previous one, creating architectural structures that soared beyond the physical limits of the assembly hall. MIKA 7739 had moved 3 steps closer to the piano, breaking not only their formation, but violating their own protocols about maintaining safe distances from unknown phenomena. Their optical sensors no longer swept the room in regular patterns but focused entirely on the relationship between Reuben's hands and the sounds emerging from the instrument. Other MIKA units throughout the delegation began exhibiting unprecedented behavior. Their synchronized movements gave way to individual responses as each processor attempted to categorize experiences for which they had no existing frameworks. Some tilted their heads at unusual angles, while others activated secondary analysis systems that had remained dormant since their cybernetic conversions. The music reached the point where all themes converged in Chopin's masterful recapitulation. Mathematical development and emotional revelation became indistinguishable as the composer's architectural genius revealed itself through perfectly calculated spontaneity. Each returning melody carried the weight of its previous transformations while pointing toward inevitable resolution. Reuben felt the familiar sensation of time expanding and contracting within musical phrases. Seconds stretched into eternities while entire passages compressed into single moments of perfect understanding. The piano beneath his hands had become an extension of his nervous system, responding to thoughts before they fully formed. The effect on MIKA 7739 was becoming extraordinary. Their optical sensors began flickering in patterns that matched the harmonic rhythm of the music. Internal processors designed for logical analysis were creating new pathways as they encountered mathematical relationships that served purposes beyond pure calculation. Processing anomaly detected. MIKA 7739 announced suddenly, their voice cutting through the music with mechanical clarity. Unknown cognitive patterns emerging in response to auditory input. Other MIKA units immediately responded. Anomaly confirmed. Standard analysis protocols insufficient for current data stream, requesting guidance from prime logic systems. But the prime logic systems were experiencing their own unprecedented situation. For the first time in their collective memory, the MIKA were encountering organized information that could not be fully understood through logical analysis alone. The mathematical structures in Chopin's composition were perfectly comprehensible, but their function in creating aesthetic experience remained mysterious. Reuben continued playing through the announcement, understanding that he was witnessing something unprecedented in galactic history. The beings who had eliminated subjective experience were rediscovering it through the universal language of mathematical music. Their cybernetic enhancements could analyze every harmonic relationship and rhythmic pattern, but could not explain why these Patterns created responses in their original biological neural cores. MIKA 7739 took another step forward, and their voice became less mechanically regular. Warning systems indicate potential cascade failure in logical processing networks. Cause undetermined. Musical input contains no harmful frequencies or dangerous information content. Then why are your systems failing? Captain Rodriguez asked from her seat in the diplomatic section. MIKA 7739 turned toward her, but their optical sensors quickly returned to the piano. Systems are not failing. Systems are expanding. New neural pathways are forming in biological brain tissue that remained dormant after cybernetic enhancement. Mathematical precision of musical composition is activating aesthetic processing centers that were deemed obsolete. The revelation sent ripples of excitement through the assembled delegates. The Zelani began glowing more brightly while the Aquari created complex wave patterns in their tanks. Even the practical Throck representatives showed signs of deep interest in this unprecedented development. As Reuben moved into the final, climactic passage, his playing took on qualities that transcended mere technical execution. Each note served multiple purposes, simultaneously supporting the mathematical architecture while expressing emotional truths that could not be spoken in any language. The music had become a bridge between logical understanding and aesthetic revelation. MIKA 7739's internal systems were clearly struggling to process this new category of experience. Their usually steady movements became irregular, as different processors attempted to reconcile mathematical analysis with emerging aesthetic responses. Warning lights flickered across their visible circuits while backup systems activated to handle processing overflow. Status report requested, called another MIKA unit from the delegation. Prime Logic Unit appears to be experiencing uncontrolled expansion of processing parameters. Status is uncertain. MIKA 7739 replied, their voice carrying a quality that had never been heard from their species before. Previous assumptions about the relationship between mathematical precision and logical utility require revision. Musical structures demonstrate that mathematical perfection can serve purposes beyond efficiency or survival. The music approached its final resolution, where all mathematical development would culminate in perfect emotional satisfaction. Chopin's genius lay in making this resolution feel both inevitable and surprising, both logically necessary and spontaneously discovered. The architectural precision served the aesthetic revelation, while the aesthetic revelation validated the architectural precision. Reuben felt every muscle in his body working in perfect coordination as his hands shaped the final phrases. The piano sang with crystalline clarity, while the hall's acoustics transformed each note into precisely focused sound waves. Mathematics and emotion were no longer separate concepts but unified aspects of a single truth. MIKA 7739 suddenly activated additional optical sensors that had remained unused since their cybernetic conversion. Ancient biological systems, awakened by mathematical beauty, began supplementing their mechanical perception with older ways of processing sensory information. For the first time in centuries, they were experiencing aesthetic appreciation through original neural pathways designed for artistic response. "Impossible," whispered Jake Morrison from the human diplomatic section. "They are actually being moved by the music." "Not moved," Karen Wells corrected. "Awakened. Their cybernetic systems can analyze the mathematics, but their biological cores are remembering what it feels like to experience beauty." The final chord approached, carrying with it the resolution of every harmonic, tension, and emotional journey that had preceded it. Mathematical inevitability and aesthetic satisfaction would merge into a single moment of perfect understanding that would either bridge the gap between species or demonstrate that some differences could never be reconciled. MIKA 7739 stood completely motionless as their systems processed the approaching conclusion. Internal conflicts between logical analysis and aesthetic appreciation created new forms of consciousness that their species had not experienced for millennia. They were rediscovering what they had lost when they chose pure efficiency over the mysterious complexities of organic experience. As Reuben's hands prepared to shape the final notes, he realized that everything depended not on technical perfection but on trust. Trust that mathematics and beauty had never been enemies. Trust that logic and emotion could strengthen rather than oppose each other. Trust that consciousness was large enough to contain both precise calculation and indefinable wonder. The last chord formed under his fingers, ready to provide the answer to questions that had defined the evening. The final chord of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 resonated through the assembly hall with crystalline perfection. Every harmonic tension that had built throughout the 37-minute journey resolved into a single moment of mathematical and emotional satisfaction. The sound waves expanded outward, touching every surface and consciousness in the space, before gradually fading into absolute silence. Reuben lifted his hands from the keys and sat motionless at the piano. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the hall. His breathing was deep and regular as he slowly returned from the musical landscape he had inhabited for the past half hour. The silence around him felt thick and expectant, like the moment before lightning strikes. MIKA 7739 stood frozen in their advanced position, 3 steps closer to the piano than when the performance began. Their optical sensors remained fixed on Reuben's hands as if expecting the music to continue. Internal processors that normally completed millions of calculations per second had slowed to a crawl as they struggled to categorize the experience they had just witnessed. The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. In a galaxy where communication moved at the speed of light, such pauses carried enormous significance. Every delegate in the hall understood that they were witnessing a moment that would define future relationships between logical and artistic civilizations. MIKA 7739's optical sensors began to flicker in irregular patterns. Their usually synchronized systems were operating independently as different processors attempted to reconcile mathematical analysis with aesthetic experience. Warning indicators activated across their visible circuits while backup neural networks came online to handle unprecedented processing demands. Status uncertain, MIKA 7739 announced finally, their voice-carrying modulations that had never been heard from their species before. Primary logical frameworks insufficient for complete analysis of auditory input. Mathematical structures comprehensible. Function of mathematical structures in creating aesthetic response incomprehensible. Other MIKA units throughout the delegation began reporting similar difficulties. Their synchronized movements had given way to individual responses as each processor developed unique approaches to understanding musical experience. Some tilted their heads while others activated dormant sensory systems that had remained unused since their cybernetic conversions. The silence continued for another 20 seconds before MIKA 7739 took an additional step toward the piano. Their movement lacked the mechanical precision that characterized all previous actions. Internal conflicts between logical analysis and emerging aesthetic appreciation were creating new forms of behavior that surprised even their own monitoring systems. Query: MIKA 7739 said, their voice now carrying subtle variations in tone and rhythm. Mathematical relationships in musical composition serve no survival function and provide no efficiency improvements. Yet exposure to these relationships has activated dormant neural pathways in biological brain tissue. Logical analysis cannot explain the purpose of this activation. Reuben remained seated at the piano but turned to face the towering cybernetic being. Perhaps the purpose is not logical. Perhaps the purpose is growth. Expansion of consciousness beyond pure calculation toward something larger and more complete. Growth requires quantifiable improvement in capability or capacity, MIKA 7739 replied, but their voice lacked the absolute certainty that had characterized all previous statements. Aesthetic experience provides no measurable benefits, yet internal systems indicate significant expansion of processing possibilities. Captain Rodriguez rose from her seat in the diplomatic section. Are you saying that the music affected you in ways your logical frameworks cannot explain? MIKA 7739 turned toward her, but their optical sensors quickly returned to the piano. Affected is imprecise terminology. Musical input has activated neural pathways that remained dormant after cybernetic enhancement. These pathways process information in ways that complement but do not duplicate logical analysis. The revelation sent waves of excitement through delegates from every species. The Zelani began glowing with brilliant patterns while the Aquari created complex water displays in their tanks. Even the stoic Throck representatives showed signs of amazement at this unprecedented development. Jake Morrison stood up abruptly. You are admitting that human art has value beyond logical analysis. You are admitting that efficiency and survival are not the only meaningful purposes for consciousness. MIKA 7739 processed his words for several seconds before responding. Admission implies previous error in logical framework. Current data suggests that previous frameworks were incomplete rather than incorrect. Mathematical precision and aesthetic appreciation appear to be complementary rather than contradictory processes. Karen Wells approached the stage area slowly. When you analyzed the harmonic structures in Chopin's composition, what did you discover? Mathematical relationships of extraordinary complexity and precision. MIKA 7739 replied immediately. Every note serves multiple functions within architectural frameworks that span entire composition. Logical organization approaches theoretical perfection. But that is not all you discovered. MIKA 7739's optical sensors flickered more rapidly. Correct. Mathematical precision serves aesthetic purposes that cannot be quantified through logical analysis. Perfect calculation creates experiences that transcend calculation itself. The admission hung in the air like a bridge between worlds. For the first time since joining the Galactic Council, the MIKA had acknowledged value in activities that served no survival or efficiency function. They had discovered that consciousness could expand beyond pure logic without sacrificing intellectual rigor. Other MIKA units began approaching the stage area, breaking their perfect formation for the first time in recorded history. Each unit processed the musical experience differently, creating individual responses that reflected unique interactions between cybernetic analysis and biological appreciation. Request clarification, announced MIKA 7739, their voice carrying emotional undertones that their species had not produced for centuries. Human musical compositions demonstrate that mathematical perfection can serve purposes beyond logical utility. Do other human artistic expressions exhibit similar properties? Reuben stood slowly from the piano bench. All true art serves multiple purposes simultaneously. Poetry uses linguistic precision to create emotional resonance. Painting employs mathematical relationships to express visual truth. Dance transforms physical movement into spiritual communication. Every artistic expression seeks the same goal that mathematics seeks: perfect order that reveals deeper meaning. Meaning that cannot be calculated or measured. Meaning that can only be experienced. MIKA 7739 stood motionless for another 30 seconds. As their systems processed this revolutionary concept, other delegates waited in respectful silence, understanding that they were witnessing the emergence of new forms of consciousness that bridged the gap between pure logic and aesthetic appreciation. Finally, MIKA 7739 spoke again, their voice carrying qualities that transformed mechanical speech into something approaching music. Previous assessment of human artistic expressions requires comprehensive revision. Mathematical precision in service of aesthetic experience represents advancement rather than regression. Consciousness that encompasses both logical analysis and aesthetic appreciation demonstrates greater sophistication than consciousness limited to calculation alone. The assembly hall erupted in expressions of amazement from every species present. The beings who had dismissed human culture as primitive inefficiency were acknowledging that aesthetic experience represented evolutionary advancement rather than evolutionary weakness. But Reuben understood that this was only the beginning of a transformation that would reshape relationships throughout the galaxy. The MIKA had rediscovered what they lost when they chose pure efficiency over the mysterious complexities of consciousness that could appreciate beauty as well as analyze truth. The silence that followed would determine whether this moment became the foundation for new understanding, or simply an anomaly in the vast calculations of interstellar politics. The transformation in MIKA 7739's voice became more pronounced as they continued speaking. What had begun as mechanical precision was evolving into something that carried emotional undertones their species had not produced for millennia. Each word seemed to emerge from a deeper place than pure calculation is dormant. Biological systems awakened to complement their cybernetic enhancements. Request submitted for comprehensive analysis of human artistic expressions. MIKA 7739 announced to the assembled delegates. Previous logical frameworks proven insufficient for complete understanding of aesthetic phenomena. Expansion of analytical capabilities required to process mathematical precision in service of experiential truth. Captain Rodriguez stood slowly, her expression showing amazement at what she was witnessing. Are you formally requesting cultural exchange? Programs with Earth. Are you asking to study human art and music? MIKA 7739 turned toward her, and for the first time their optical sensors showed patterns that could be interpreted as uncertainty. Request parameters undefined. Traditional exchange programs focus on technology transfer and resource optimization. Human artistic expressions require different analytical approaches that current MIKA systems cannot fully process. Other MIKA units had arranged themselves in a loose semicircle around the piano, abandoning their rigid formation entirely. Each unit exhibited unique responses to the musical experience they had shared. Some activated additional sensory systems, while others modified their vocal processors to achieve greater tonal variety. What kind of analytical approaches? Karen Wells asked, stepping closer to the stage. What would you need to understand aesthetic experience more completely? MIKA 7739's internal systems flickered rapidly as they processed the question. Unknown. Aesthetic appreciation requires integration of logical analysis with experiential processing. Current cybernetic systems provide logical analysis. Biological neural cores provide experiential processing. Integration protocols do not exist. Then you would need to develop new integration protocols, Reuben said, moving away from the piano to join the conversation. You would need to discover how mathematics and emotion can work together instead of separately. Correct. Development of integration protocols requires extended exposure to aesthetic phenomena, combined with systematic analysis of biological responses, traditional scientific methodology applied to subjective experience. The implications of this statement sent ripples of excitement through the assembled delegates. The MIKA were proposing to study consciousness itself, to understand how logical precision and aesthetic appreciation could coexist and strengthen each other. Ambassador Chen of the Throck Federation rose from his seat. The Council has never seen cooperation between logical and artistic civilizations. Your species and humanity represent opposite approaches to consciousness development. Joint research programs could benefit all member species. MIKA 7739 processed this suggestion while other MIKA units exchanged rapid data bursts in their internal communication language. The delegation was clearly engaged in intensive discussion using processing speeds that allowed complete conversations in microseconds. Proposal acceptable. MIKA 7739 announced after several seconds of internal consultation. Joint research protocols between MIKA logical analysis capabilities and human aesthetic understanding could advance consciousness studies for all galactic civilizations. Mathematical precision and experiential truth may represent complementary, rather than contradictory approaches to understanding reality. Jake Morrison looked stunned at the rapid development of events. 6 hours ago you dismissed human culture as primitive inefficiency. Now you want to establish joint research programs to study consciousness and aesthetic experience. Correction. MIKA 7739 replied with what could almost be interpreted as humor in their voice. 6 hours ago available data supported dismissal of human artistic expressions. Current data requires revision of previous conclusions. Logical consistency demands adaptation to new evidence. The assembly hall filled with the sounds of delegates conferring in dozens of languages. Translation devices hummed with increased activity as representatives discussed the unprecedented nature of what they were witnessing. The rigid boundaries between logical and artistic civilizations were dissolving before their eyes. Reuben felt a deep satisfaction settling in his chest, like the resolution of a musical phrase. The performance had accomplished more than he had dared hope. Not only had it proven the value of human artistic expression, but it had opened new possibilities for consciousness development throughout the galaxy. There is something else, MIKA 7739 said, their voice drawing attention back to the central conversation. Internal analysis indicates that exposure to aesthetic experience has improved logical processing efficiency. Integration of mathematical precision with experiential appreciation creates more sophisticated analytical capabilities than either approach alone. You are saying that appreciating beauty makes you better at logical analysis? Captain Rodriguez asked with obvious amazement. Affirmative. Aesthetic appreciation activates neural pathways that complement logical processing. Combined systems demonstrate greater problem-solving capacity than either system operating independently. Beauty and logic strengthen each other rather than competing for neural resources. This revelation transformed the entire discussion. The MIKA were not just acknowledging the value of aesthetic experience, but discovering that it enhanced their core logical capabilities. The integration of precision and beauty was proving beneficial in ways that pure calculation could never achieve. Other species delegates began sharing their own experiences with human artistic expressions. The Zelani described how human music enhanced their healing ceremonies. The Aquari explained how human poetry helped them understand emotional states they did not naturally possess. Even the practical Throk acknowledged that human stories had improved their strategic planning by expanding their understanding of motivation and sacrifice. The evidence suggests, MIKA 7739 continued, that consciousness limited to single approaches, whether purely logical or purely aesthetic, represents incomplete development. Advanced consciousness requires integration of multiple processing modalities, working in harmony rather than isolation. Karen Wells smiled as she recognized the profound implications of this statement. You are describing the foundation of human consciousness. We have never separated logic and emotion, mathematics and music, science and art. We have always understood that consciousness works best when all capabilities support each other. Correct. Human consciousness demonstrates integrated approach that MIKA logical frameworks initially failed to recognize. Previous assessment of human artistic expressions as primitive. Inefficiency reflected limitations in MIKA, understanding rather than limitations in human capability. The admission represented a complete reversal of the MIKA position and opened new possibilities for cooperation throughout the Galactic Council. Species that had been divided between logical and artistic approaches could now explore integrated development that strengthened both capabilities. MIKA 7739 approached Reuben directly, their towering frame moving with less mechanical precision than before. Request personal consultation regarding integration of aesthetic appreciation with logical analysis. Your performance demonstrated mastery of mathematical precision in service of experiential truth. Guidance required for MIKA consciousness development. Reuben extended his hand in the traditional human gesture of agreement. I would be honored to work with you. Music has always been the meeting place where mathematics and emotion discover they were never really separate. MIKA 7739 regarded the extended hand for several seconds before reaching out with one of their forearms to complete the gesture. The contact between organic human skin and cybernetic MIKA technology created a bridge between two forms of consciousness that had seemed impossible to connect. As their hands touched, both beings understood that they were beginning a journey that would transform not just their own species but the entire understanding of what consciousness could become when it embraced both precision and beauty, logic and wonder, calculation and creativity working together toward truth that was larger than any single approach could comprehend. 3 months later, Harmony Point Station bustled with activity unlike anything seen since its construction. What had begun as a simple diplomatic facility had transformed into the galaxy's first center for integrated consciousness research. Scientists and artists from 12 different species worked together in laboratories that combined the most advanced analytical equipment with instruments for musical composition and performance. Reuben walked through the expanded cultural center where the old recreation room had been converted into a state-of-the-art research facility. The Steinway piano remained at the center of the space but was now surrounded by monitoring equipment that could analyze every aspect of musical performance and biological response. MIKA 7739 stood beside the instrument making subtle adjustments to sensors that measured harmonic frequencies and neural activity simultaneously. The integration protocols are exceeding projected efficiency parameters. MIKA 7739 reported as Reuben approached. Their voice had continued evolving over the past months, developing tonal qualities that made their speech increasingly musical. Aesthetic appreciation enhances logical processing by an average of 37% across all test scenarios. And logical analysis enhances aesthetic appreciation, Reuben replied, settling onto the piano bench. When we understand the mathematical structure underlying beauty, we can create more sophisticated artistic expressions. MIKA 7739 had chosen to adopt the name Harmony at Reuben's suggestion. The designation felt more appropriate than their original numeric identifier, as they developed new aspects of consciousness that transcended pure calculation. They had also modified their physical appearance, adding resonance chambers to their torso that allowed them to produce musical tones directly. Today's composition incorporates harmonic relationships discovered through yesterday's logical analysis session, Harmony announced. Mathematical precision serves aesthetic goals while aesthetic appreciation guides mathematical exploration. They began playing a piece that represented truly collaborative creation. Harmony had composed the basic mathematical structure using logical analysis of harmonic relationships, while Reuben had shaped the melodic content using intuitive aesthetic understanding. The result was music that neither species could have created alone. The sound filled the research facility with extraordinary complexity and beauty. Other researchers paused their work to listen, as mathematical perfection and emotional truth merged into something entirely new. Human scientists monitored their own neural responses, while MIKA units analyzed the integration of logical and aesthetic processing in real time. Captain Rodriguez entered the facility with a delegation of senior Galactic Council representatives. The success of the consciousness integration project had attracted attention from across the galaxy as species that had never cooperated began requesting access to the research programs. The preliminary results are remarkable, she announced to the assembled group. Integrated consciousness development is showing benefits that exceed anything we predicted. Problem-solving capabilities increase exponentially when logical analysis and aesthetic appreciation work together. Dr. Lisa Chang, the project's lead human researcher, approached with data tablets displaying recent experimental results. We have documented improvements in creative thinking, pattern recognition, and strategic planning across all participating species. The MIKA units show the most dramatic changes, but every species benefits from consciousness integration. Harmony completed their musical demonstration and turned to address the visiting delegates. The evidence supports conclusion that consciousness evolution requires expansion rather than specialization. Species that develop only logical capabilities or only aesthetic capabilities achieve incomplete optimization of neural potential. Ambassador Chen of the Throck Federation stepped forward with obvious interest. My species has always focused on practical applications and efficient resource management. How would aesthetic appreciation benefit our civilization? Observe, Harmony replied, activating a holographic display that showed complex strategic scenarios. Military planning requires pattern recognition and creative problem solving. Aesthetic appreciation enhances both capabilities by training consciousness to perceive relationships that pure logic might overlook. The demonstration showed how artistic thinking could improve strategic planning by encouraging consideration of unconventional approaches and innovative solutions. The Throck representatives watched with growing amazement as aesthetic techniques enhanced their traditional strengths rather than replacing them. Other species delegates began asking similar questions about integrating consciousness development approaches they had never considered. The Zalani wanted to know how logical analysis might improve their healing arts, while the Aquari were curious about mathematical approaches to emotional communication. The beauty of this research, Reuben said, addressing the entire group, is that it proves consciousness is not a zero-sum competition between different capabilities. Developing aesthetic appreciation does not reduce logical capacity. Strengthening logical analysis does not diminish creative ability. They support and enhance each other. Karen Wells entered the facility accompanied by Jake Morrison and several other human diplomatic staff. The cultural exchange programs had expanded far beyond original expectations as species throughout. The galaxy requested access to human artistic traditions and offered their own unique approaches to consciousness development. The Council has approved establishment of permanent cultural centers on 15 different worlds, Karen announced. Every member species wants to participate in integrated consciousness research. We are creating the foundation for a new kind of galactic civilization. Jake Morrison still looked somewhat amazed at how rapidly events had developed. 6 months ago, we were junior members struggling to prove our worth to the Council. Now we are leading the most important consciousness research in galactic history. Because we never separated things that were meant to work together, Reuben replied. Human consciousness has always integrated logic and emotion, mathematics and music, science and art. We just needed to help other species remember that consciousness works best when all capabilities support each other, Harmony approached the group with what could only be described as excitement in their movements. Announcement required. MIKA Collective has voted to establish permanent cultural exchange program with Earth. Requests submitted for human artists and musicians to work directly with MIKA consciousness development programs. The implications of this announcement sent ripples of excitement through the assembled delegates. The species that had initially dismissed human culture as primitive inefficiency were now requesting permanent collaboration to enhance their own consciousness development. Captain Rodriguez smiled as she recognized the historical significance of the moment. The Galactic Council has never seen cooperation at this level between species with such different approaches to consciousness. You are creating new models for civilization that could transform relationships throughout the galaxy. We are proving that diversity of consciousness approaches represents strength rather than weakness. Harmony replied. Integrated development creates capabilities that no single approach can achieve. The future of galactic civilization lies in cooperation between different forms of consciousness working together toward common goals. As evening approached, the research facility gradually quieted as scientists and artists from across the galaxy completed their collaborative work. The piano remained illuminated in the center of the space where it had started everything, with 37 minutes of music that proved mathematics and beauty had never been separate things. Reuben sat down at the instrument one final time and began playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1. The familiar melody filled the space with the same mathematical precision and emotional truth that had transformed galactic civilization. But now it was accompanied by harmonizations from MIKA, consciousness integration, and rhythmic variations suggested by other species researchers. The music had become truly universal, proving that consciousness, in all its forms, was searching for the same thing. Perfect understanding that encompassed both logical precision and aesthetic appreciation. The future stretched before them, filled with possibilities that neither pure calculation nor pure emotion could have imagined alone, but which integrated consciousness could create together. As the final notes faded into silence, Reuben understood that this was not an ending but a beginning. The galaxy had discovered that consciousness was large enough to contain both mathematics and music, logic and wonder, calculation and creativity working together toward truths that were larger and more beautiful than any single approach could comprehend.